let's start. We arrived at the last panel of this conference on carbon pricing. So let me take this opportunity just to make sure we thank enough the organizers. So we thank once more for the organization, and I'm sure we'll have the opportunity to thank again at the end of this panel. So this panel is naturally on a distributional issue between countries. We've seen the one before within countries, so that's the natural next one. And so the subtitles of the panel then is unprecedented global cooperation is clearly required, but is it possible? So we have three talks lined up. So we're going to now start with Liam, who's a lecturer at Royal Holloway and is also a research associate at ETH Zurich. So what he's going to be presenting today, the title, as we can already read, is When and Where Do International Commitment Matter? So Liam, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the invitation to speak today, and also to be able to attend this conference the past couple of days has been really thought-provoking in terms of the papers and the discussions. And so really building off of these discussions, right, a key thing that's kind of come up is we know a lot about the kind of economic arguments as to why carbon pricing is important, or dare say essential for mitigating climate change. But as we've talked about over the last couple of days, there are severe political feasibility issues, right? Whether that's on the streets, with, say, as example, the Gilets Jaunes movement in France, or at the ballot box with the Washington Initiative or referenda in Switzerland recently. And so what I'm going to do in this talk today is present some research that allows us to think about how the international context potentially plays a role in this regard, in maybe facilitating political support or also potentially limiting political support. And so quite simply, the basic idea is to think about what evidence there is that says whether international commitments are necessary for public support for carbon pricing. Now, if we look at environmental action more generally and whether the public supports this, a kind of broad consensus has emerged over the past 10 years or so that actually suggests that the international actions and commitments of other countries doesn't matter too much for engendering political support domestically. So the World Bank in 2010 had this survey about whether you feel that you would have a responsibility to engage in climate change mitigation, regardless of whether other countries actually do so. And these purple bars here are the proportion of people who said they would, and you see there's an overwhelming majority. Literature review that I've done in collaboration with Thomas Bernauer, but also more recent theoretical and empirical work by Michael Eklund and Mirzo Mildenberger also tends to suggest that people aren't too concerned about what other countries are actually doing when it comes to supporting environmental action. Now, what I want to talk about today is whether this is going to apply to the case of carbon pricing, and actually show some research that suggests maybe this is not going to translate one-to-one in this regard. So why is carbon pricing potentially different? Well, Matto earlier provided a great kind of summary and logic as to understanding the political feasibility of carbon pricing, why it differs potentially from other environmental policies. So this being that there are kind of direct, immediate, visible costs to individuals that is directly tied into their behavior, and the benefits are not really upfront, unless you have things such as revenue recycling. More broadly, you see also in a policy discussion when we think about border adjustments, but also in terms of day-to-day discussions about fairness, there's a concern about an international level playing field and a concern about taking action in terms of carbon pricing when other countries have not adopted carbon pricing as well. So I want to basically go through three studies and three pieces of research of mine that speak directly to this. So the first is going to look at public support for kind of a comprehensive carbon tax being adopted and how the behavior of other countries potentially influences this, looking at the case of USA and Germany. Then the second part is going to look at, for a country that already has a carbon tax, although a relatively small one, in this case Japan, whether the behavior and actions and commitments of other countries affect support for changing and increasing the scale of the carbon tax. And then thirdly, to discuss whether carbon pricing can be affected by spillover from other issues about international collaboration. And so this is going to be looking at carbon pricing in the context of Brexit in the UK, so the decision to leave the EU. So first off, kind of support for adopting a comprehensive carbon tax. So this is based off of a paper that was published in 2019 with Thomas Bernauer, that more generally was looking at the idea of revenue recycling, how the revenue raised from carbon taxation affects its political feasibility. But this was done in the context of a conjoint experiment, meaning people were choosing between different policy designs of a carbon tax. And so while the size of the carbon tax in terms of its price, in terms of tons of CO2 emitted, was one feature, and while revenue usage was another feature, we also looked at whether international involvement is relevant. So the context of, are other countries getting involved or not? And so this is based off of representative surveys in Germany and the USA. Now, to look at the issue of other countries, what I'm simply doing here is seeing how support for different price levels of the carbon tax, ranging from $10 to $70 per ton, ultimately depends on whether other countries are going to be adopting at the same time or not. And ultimately, to get to these kind of effective levels of carbon taxation, right? So the $50 figure is often bandied about. Of course, we know this is subject to debate. What you see is that you really need the buy-in from other countries as well. So if we were to look at the kind of far right column, middle panel, what we see is that if all industrialized countries kind of sign up and get involved as well, then both in the USA and in Germany, you can get to around majority support for quite high levels of carbon taxation. The issue is if no other countries are involved and you're kind of going it alone, well, then you fail to receive a majority of support in Germany. And in the US, you only get to about $30 per ton. Now, we could, of course, discuss why there are differences between these countries. Of course, Germany already has carbon pricing in forms of their EU ETS. So maybe that reduces willingness to pay for other kind of carbon pricing. And so in that regard, I'll focus more on the US case where there isn't this carbon pricing at the kind of federal level in the same regard. And so this is based off of this same data, but some kind of more recent research kind of trying to expand and project these results into the US states. And what you find is if you have a $50 carbon tax with no other countries kind of committing to do anything, no revenue recycling, then you only ever see a majority of support compared to opposition in the state of New York. Okay, every other state, you see more people opposing than supporting. If other industrialized countries are involved, so kind of OECD type countries, well, that actually shifts the balance to there being more supporters than opposers in the vast majority of the states. So the international context is important when thinking about domestic support for carbon pricing. What's interesting and tying back to the previous panel on these distributional issues is that a similar kind of compensation effect can occur if you use a tax rebate, even though no other countries are involved. So to some extent, international action can be a substitute for domestic policy design. What's also important as a context here, though, is that this is looking at support versus opposition. This is leaving out those who are indifferent. So this may not necessarily translate to a large majority of individuals in the first place. So that's the kind of context of let's come up and let's adopt a new carbon tax. What about the case where we have a carbon tax in place, but want to increase its ambition, want to increase its scale? And I hope the large torrential downpour isn't drowning me out too much here. So this is from recent research that was just published in Climatic Change about a month ago. That is looking about the case of Japan. So Japan has had a carbon tax for almost a decade, but it's at a very low level if we think about effective carbon taxation. So approximately $2.6. So the idea here is to look at whether the international level of action, the international commitments have an impact in terms of increasing the Japanese public's support for a more ambitious carbon tax. We look at this through their kind of support for increasing or decreasing carbon taxation, willingness to pay in terms of direct monetary amounts, and also, again, another kind of policy design conjoint experiment to look at potential different carbon tax forms. So we do this by randomly assigning information about carbon taxation in other countries. So simply about whether other countries do or do not have carbon taxation, but also about the price levels of carbon taxation in other countries. So whether there's a reference point of countries having more ambitious carbon prices, right? So for example, like Switzerland, Norway, or examples of countries that actually have lower carbon prices than Japan. Ultimately, what you see is that when provided information that others do not have a carbon tax, this decreases ambition levels for the Japanese public in terms of increasing their current carbon tax in the future. But an even stronger effect arises from learning that others have a carbon tax, but it happens to be lower than Japan's. And so this suggests that there are some potential issues in terms of the laws of the least ambitious program, where if you learn that other countries have the same policy, but at a lower level than you, you may kind of go to that race to the bottom to some extent. We can also look at this in terms of the forms of international commitments that the Japanese public like and would look for in this case. And so what we find in this regard is that ultimately, when provided information that other countries have lower levels or a lack of carbon taxation, individuals want kind of get out clauses in their carbon taxes. So they want to have the ability or the commitment that in 5 years' time, if this situation didn't change, then we would actually reduce or even abolish the carbon tax. Ultimately, other countries simply having a carbon tax doesn't really do much in terms of increasing this aspect and in terms of increasing cooperation. So this is looking very concretely at what is the state of play in other countries in terms of carbon pricing, what is the state of play in the international arena in terms of carbon pricing, and how that affects individuals' willingness to pay, how it affects individual support for carbon pricing. What I want to go on to now is a kind of new emerging field, a new emerging area of research, which is whether kind of there is a spillover from other political issues that are decided at the international level, and whether this ultimately has an impact on carbon pricing as well. So thinking a bit more broader in terms of the international arena and its consequences for mitigating climate change. And so being based in the UK, a natural thing to think about here is the issue of Brexit. So why is this important to think about? Well, Brexit necessitates that the UK potentially changes, or would have changed, how they dealt with pricing carbon. While they were part of the European Union, they were part of the European Union's emissions trading system. Brexit, however, leads to them adopting a new policy. So in this regard, it's currently that they've continued an emissions trading system. But we're interested in this respect to figure out, okay, whether the issue of Brexit, whether the identities people have formed in terms of being Brexit voters or not, and whether the issue of carbon pricing is linked to the EU or not, ultimately has a consequence in terms of their preferences in the long run policy choices for mitigating climate change through carbon pricing. So what we do is ultimately look at individuals' preferences between four kind of policy options. So an emissions trading system where it's only within the UK, so not linked to any other countries, a linked emissions trading system, a carbon tax, or simply just having no future carbon pricing policy. On top of this, there's kind of built in a survey experiment where this linked ETS for roughly half of the sample is linked explicitly to the EU. So the kind of continuation of what happened before Brexit. The other half of the sample get linked to other countries in general. And so this is going to allow us to see whether the issue of previous EU linkage spills over to the idea of linkage in general in the future. And then key to this, as we'll see, is that we need to be comparing those who are Brexiteers versus those who are Remainers, because this is a kind of important political cleavage in this regard.
You have 2 minutes left.
Excellent. So simply comparing the emissions trading systems, whether these are linked to the UK or linked to the EU, what we see in this regard is that there's on average a bit more support for an emissions trading system that's linked to the EU. Of course, this is masking the divide driven by Brexit. So people who supported Brexit are much more likely to support a UK-only emissions trading system. People who wanted to remain in the EU are even more likely to want to continue an emissions trading system linked with the EU. Now, the key thing is that this is constant also across other countries. So the idea of linking in general has been kind of polarized through this previous EU linkage. And so what you see is similar kind of patterns, even if the linkage were to other countries and not specifically to the EU. So the polarization from international commitments previously that have been politicized through Brexit has consequences for the long run trajectory of public support for carbon pricing in the UK. So to summarize, international commitments, I hope I've convinced you here, are necessary for trying to understand how the public thinks about and whether the public actually supports carbon pricing and the form it takes on. A lack of international action can really both stifle the willingness to adopt a new carbon tax, but also to scale up an existing carbon tax to more ambitious levels. And the issue is remaining and starting to become potentially even more salient. The support may fall into existing political cleavages and conflicts at the international level that gets transmitted down to the domestic level through Brexit, but also, as you see in the case of US, through other political identities. So thank you very much, and looking forward to the discussion and the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Liam, for this overview of a few pieces of your work. That was very interesting. So next, we're gonna hear from Ballou from Vanderbilt. So he's gonna talk about obstacle to rainforest preservation.
The title of this talk has changed from what appears in the program, and the reason for that is I started off thinking generally, what are the problems that are going to arise when the rest of the world tries to pay rainforest countries to preserve the forests? And I got quite a long list of issues, and it occurred to me I ought to see how ongoing efforts in this area are dealing with these issues. So I started reading up on REDD+, and the more I read, the more it occurred to me I ought to be talking about this. So now I'm going to focus mostly on REDD+, and I hope some of the more general points that I had originally intended to make will emerge as I go. I also want to qualify this by pointing out that REDD+ is an ambitious and complicated package of policies and programs. And by no means is this a comprehensive look at that package. Rather, I'm focusing on REDD+ as a vehicle for arranging those sorts of transfers that would induce rainforest countries to cut back significantly on deforestation. Okay, so what are we dealing with here? REDD+ stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation. It was negotiated in the UN Framework on Climate Change. That framework was initially known as simply REDD, and it envisioned a larger role for small-scale projects financed by the purchase of carbon credits, more or less a decentralized marketplace. So the participants could be countries, regions, communities, associations of producers, rarely though individual farmers or ranchers. Now, in its latest incarnation, REDD+ emphasizes agreements at the national level. And what we're seeing more and more is carbon credits that are obtained by adhering to the protocols are being used more often to meet a country's commitments to emissions reductions rather than being sold on the voluntary carbon market. So the market, the idea this is a market for paying for rainforest preservation is taking a back seat to other things at the moment. When you do have credits being sold, the prices in question are arrived at through bilateral negotiations, but not through impersonal market forces. The emissions reductions are often achieved by enforcing existing restrictions on land use rather than imposing new restrictions on farmers and ranchers. And in contrast to a decentralized marketplace, largely as a result of what I just pointed out, RED Plus operates essentially through command and control measures in which producers may or may not be compensated for their opportunity costs. Do we need to compensate producers? Well, if enforcement by national governments works, we're getting what we want. On the other hand, it seems to me we probably do need compensation that gets down to the level of the individual producer, because in the absence of that compensation, they will tend to ignore restrictions on land use that have been negotiated at a higher level, and possibly with the connivance of authorities. And you can expect political pressure to withdraw from these agreements if the people who are really bearing the costs of complying with these restrictions are not being compensated. Okay. So how does compensation work in this framework? A baseline rate of emissions is determined for each participating entity based on recent historical rates of deforestation, primarily. Also taking into account established patterns of land use, planned development, and fine-grained studies of forest carbon content. So with all that, you sort of figure out what would be business as usual in terms of emissions, and then the reductions are calculated as the difference between that baseline and the subsequent actual rate once a country or some other entity has entered into a RED Plus agreement. The credits for the reductions can be sold on a carbon exchange, although I pointed out most presently are not. The proceeds of those sales can be used to compensate stakeholders or to defray monitoring, enforcement, and transactions costs, or for some form of capacity building, which could include clarifying land tenure or promoting sustainable forest use. So what are some of the problems that I see with this framework? Well, first, it's difficult, if not impossible, to ascertain the counterfactual when you get down to the level of individual producers. How much deforestation would a given producer have undertaken in the absence of RED Plus? So if you even have compensation getting down to the level of the individual producer, you're likely to overcompensate some and undercompensate others. Relevant stakeholders may not even be identified or may not be eligible for compensation given all the uncertainties about land tenure in these countries. And the revenues frequently, what you're seeing now in the latest set of agreements, is these sorts of revenues being spent on community projects as an alternative to individual payments. And not that these are without merit, still you might expect that individual producers would regard this kind of in-kind compensation as inferior. Just give us the money, right? So that's one set of issues. Here's another. In the RED Plus framework, the participants are eventually going to exhaust their emissions reductions credits. So you're credited only once for a given emissions reduction. You can't claim that reduction a second time in a subsequent year. So what this means is if you're a participating entity with a deforestation rate of V, that's your baseline rate, and it falls to S under RED Plus, you're going to exhaust your possible credits in 1 over V minus S years. And though there's a simple example down here that shows how if you're projected to completely remove your forests in 20 years, you could get a credit for the emissions avoided equal to 1/20th of that. But after 20 years, it's gone. You've exhausted the credits you might earn. So what happens then? Well, the participating entity isn't going to get any more payments. It's gotten all it's ever going to get. So it has no further incentive to continue to refrain from deforestation. Now, it's been proposed that you could take the payments received for emissions reduction and put them in some kind of fund out of which you could generate compensation for farmers and ranchers into the indefinite future. However, you could have adverse movements in the market that could cause the fund to run short, increases in prices of agricultural goods, or a decline in interest rates could mean you no longer have enough money in the fund to cover current opportunity costs. Also, participating governments could divert a significant share of these revenues to other uses, which would obviously limit what's available for compensation. This is my attempt here at humor. I wrote may divert. If I were being serious, I would have written will certainly divert. So, you know, there we are. On the positive side, at recent rates of deforestation, REDD+ participants are not likely to exhaust these potential credits for several decades. But on the negative side, this problem is exacerbated by the fact that REDD+ updates the baseline rates every 10 years. So this amazed me when I discovered this. So REDD+ requires emissions baselines to be revised every 10 years. So for simplicity, assume that carbon per hectare doesn't vary. So the emissions reductions are just a constant multiple of avoided deforestation. If the deforestation rate realized under REDD+ during the first 10 years becomes the baseline for the next 10 years, and so on, then the avoided deforestation is going to amount to what that expression you have in the middle of this slide. And it all comes down to the initial baseline minus the baseline 100 years out times 10. So suppose the price of carbon remains constant over this period, and if we ignore discounting, what this implies is the maximum the entity can earn per hectare of forest land is therefore P times A times 10 times V naught, where P is the price of carbon and A is the amount of sequestered carbon per hectare. So that's the de facto ceiling on your emission reduction payments. So in effect, only a 10-year horizon matters, provided you're able to reduce emissions from deforestation to zero at once. If it takes longer to reach zero emissions, the payments are going to continue for a longer period, but the cumulative total will not exceed this ceiling. And once you allow for discounting, it's going to fall short of the ceiling. So the impact on total compensation can be quite severe. For example, if the baseline rate of deforestation is 1%, a country requires 100 years at that rate to exhaust its forest. However, under REDD+ rules, the participating country receives credit for only 1/10 of the associated reductions at best. So here's some illustrative calculations. Suppose, and some of these are ballpark numbers that actually, fit the facts. Let the tons of sequestered carbon per hectare be 500. That's an average over the Brazilian Amazon. Take a price of the carbon per ton in voluntary carbon markets, which has been a little bit under $5 in recent years. Suppose, just hypothetically, your baseline deforestation rate is 1%. Then the formula that I put up a moment ago says the maximum payment you're going to get per hectare is $230. That's undiscounted. But the average value of a hectare of Amazonian pasture land is $500. So you're short of covering the opportunity cost. Now, let's put in a real deforestation rate. Annual deforestation in the Amazon, the Brazilian Amazon, over this 10-year period here, averaged just under 20,000 square kilometers a year. So this is a baseline rate of less than 1/1000%. And if you substitute that rate into the previous formula, you're going to obtain a maximum payment per hectare of 28 cents. Now, some regions of the Amazon, the baseline deforestation rate is much higher, but those are also the regions where the value of cropland and pasture land is higher. So let's take the state of Rondônia. 2.8% is about the highest the deforestation rate got in recent years. If we substitute that rate into the previous calculation, we get a maximum payment per hectare of $650. But the average price of farmland in Rondônia over this period was twice that. So if half the rainforest in Rondônia is never going to be converted to agricultural uses, if you paid $650 per hectare to restrict the other half, you're just about compensating producers for the opportunity cost of that restriction. However, if all of Rondônia was on track to be deforested, and that looks more or less like where it was going, $650 is going to fall short of what you need to compensate producers. So either needed a much higher price for carbon or redesign of RED Plus so that participating countries aren't essentially being penalized for success, which is what this revision of the baseline is doing. Well, could we just dispense with revising the baseline? It's hard to see how you're going to get what you really want by revising the baseline. If you want an estimate of the counterfactual quantity of emissions in the absence of RED, I don't know how you're going to be getting that if you look at data from a period when RED programs were in effect. And neither can we assume that if we look at areas that aren't included in RED Plus programs, they're going to give us the relevant counterfactual for fairly obvious reasons.
You have 2 minutes left.
Okay, but if we assume the initial baselines would continue into the indefinite future, then we're ignoring some important things like changing patterns of land use, changes in agricultural markets, and the dire possibility of rainforest dieback once deforestation reaches critical tipping point. So you go out 10 or 20 years, and I don't think the baseline is going to represent an accurate counterfactual at all. So the whole notion that we're paying for emissions reduction seems to me to be a fiction. What else might we try doing? Well, what we could try doing is essentially the sort of thing we do in the United States all the time. If we want farmers not to produce on some land, we pay them to enroll it in some sort of reserve. So here's what this might look like. You could pay landowners, and by landowners, I mean whoever actually has legal and practical control over rainforest lands. And that is the big problem here, establishing that. But if that could be achieved, then you just pay people to enroll their land in a forest reserve for a certain number of years. They have to abide by restrictions. And then when that period runs out, they can renew. One possibility would be to ask them to submit bids for inclusion in the reserve. If they bid, then we take the best bids first up until the point where we either got all we want and we've spent all our money. And the advantages vis-a-vis RED Plus are you're not capping your payments, you're not exhausting your payments after a certain number of years. The payments don't automatically decline as deforestation rates fall. And even the landowners whose bids are not initially accepted may be deterred from clearing their land by the prospect of losing out on future payments. Now, there are some problems with the bidding notion, and in light of those problems, you might want to just say, well, we'll just announce prices. We won't rely on people to bid. We'll just announce the price, and then it's up to you if you want to enroll your land or not. And that all seems possible. So the final point I have to make here is let's just look at another illustrative calculation. If your carbon price were $40 a ton, which of course is much higher than anything we're seeing now, but much lower than what could be justified, the 500 tons of sequestered carbon per hectare in the Amazonian rainforest has a present value of $20,000. Now, if you amortize this over 100 years at a 3% real interest rate, the annualized value is approximately $600. That's what you would want to pay per year to enroll somebody in one of these programs, because that's essentially what you're getting. By inducing someone to enroll in this program, you are putting off by one more year the prospect of deforestation. Well, that $600 well exceeds the annual profits from Amazonian cropland or pasture, which are at most in the range of $200, $300. And in many cases, I've seen a lot of figures below 100. So there's a lot of room here to strike a deal. The downside is you've got to gap this wide, you've got a lot to fight over. So that's where it stands right now in terms of the existing framework for buying off countries that have a lot of rainforest.
Thank you very much for this interesting talk. Next we have Kian. Kian is a lecturer at the University College of Cork. Today is talking about internalizing externalities across spatial and temporal scale. Okay, so Kian, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So thanks so much for having me. I'm very excited to be part of this event, and I've really enjoyed it so far. So I'm trained as a moral philosopher, so I'm quite different than in background than many of you. And so what I'm going to offer are, let's say, somewhat more theoretical and maybe more provocative of thoughts. So the first thing to say is that this work, there's two sort of streams of this work. The first has to do with discounting, which we talked a lot about, in particular, pure rates of time preference. So the first point I want to make is that when we're thinking about justifications of pure rates of time preference, very famous ones, in particular offered by Nicholas Stern in the Stern Review, I think can be better understood and can be put on a principled basis. So Stern says that we should, he justifies a positive pure rate of time preference by appealing to existential risk, the exogenous likelihood that humanity will go extinct. And I want to suggest that we can actually justify this in a principled way and say that there's something deeper underlying this example. And that's when we're talking about events that would prevent our initial policies from having an effect. So that suggestion is that that generalizes this motivation and it provides a principle for it. So that's the first provocation. And the second is if we're thinking about internalizing externalities, so of course, when we're thinking about generating the right incentives for various policies that have to do with emitting, we're familiar with the motivations of introducing carbon prices and carbon taxes, which is to internalize negative externalities. With a colleague named Justin Leroux, an economist in Montreal, we argue that similar reasoning would suggest that we would want to internalize positive externalities. So first, it's worth giving a little bit of evidence that there are positive climate externalities. That's not maybe surprising. They're relatively small, obviously, but there are positive externalities. And my claim, or our claim, is that a proper theory of addressing externalities should incorporate these as well. And so we suggest a little bit about how you might think about that. And that should also be somewhat provocative in that we're saying that in some small way, that would actually entail side payments or transfers to emitters. Okay, so let's talk about this first idea about positive rates of time preference. So here we're operating within a standard Ramsey growth model. So we know the approximation for an optimal social discount rate is delta, that's the pure rate of time preference, plus eta, the elasticity of marginal utility of consumption, multiplied by the growth rate of consumption. So in this context, Stern points out that when we're looking at these integrated assessment models and as cost-benefit analyses, that extinction risk is exogenous to them. And in particular, he's concerned with PAGE, which is one of the major IAMs, especially that's used at the London School of Economics. And so once we have this extinction risk, his point is that we can incorporate that by having a positive pure rate of time preference, a positive delta. You have some assumptions on that has to be subject to the risk growing in a relatively predictable way and so forth. But the idea here is that if that's exogenous to the model, we can incorporate it in this way. Now, why would we want to do that? Well, of course, we know that there are several theoretical problems or concerns about having a zero pure rate of time preference. So Arrow in the RFF Pardee and Way volume suggests that it might be over demanding to have a zero delta. And there's some other reasons as well having to do with convergent streams of benefits. But the idea here is that we can justify this, he thinks, even if we take people to be purely equally valuable regardless of when they exist. And I'll mention that that's what many philosophers think is true, especially utilitarian philosophers. Okay, so here's my point. My point is that the justification underlying this is actually a little bit more subtle than might be obvious. So why would we want to have a positive pure rate of time preference representing extinction? Well, it's not because after humanity goes extinct that there's no growth. Obviously, that's not it. It's the G eta term is a different part of the social discount rate. A little bit more subtly, it's not because welfare is zero after extinction. So we have no social welfare. If it was that, then we would not include, say, if there was a policy that might increase the risk of extinction, we wouldn't discount for that. So my suggestion is actually it's because extinction implies that our initial climate policies have no subsequent effect. So if we're comparing different policies, after the point of extinction, our initial choices no longer have an effect. if that's the case, so I suggest that that in a piece that if there are these, if that's the case, then in theory, any outcome such that it prevents the initial actions from having subsequent consumption or welfare effects would justify a license a positive delta. So of course, the immediate question is, what kind of outcomes would these be? Of course, that would depend on which models we're talking about. So what's exogenous to the model depends on what's in the model. But we can talk about these a little bit. So the first group is the group that Stern is interested in. So exogenous risk of existential catastrophe, such as asteroids. But even if we survive, we might think that our policies don't have an effect because, for instance, we leave the planet and we no longer are subject to this ecosystem. In the short and medium term, this is extremely unlikely, obviously, but theoretically speaking, it has the right structure that it justifies a positive period of time preference if we think that it's exogenous and that it's increasing in the relevant way. And even if we stay on Earth, again, this is even more speculative, but we might somehow be protected from them. So some theorists think we could have some dome world where we're protected, or some transhumanists think we could somehow protect ourselves by having our being embedded in silicone or having our consciousness downloaded or something like this. I don't take these very seriously, but again, the point is that in principle, these would justify a positive period of time preference as well. And so the point is that if our initial policy fails to have an effect after that point, then that justifies it. Okay, so that's my first provocation. Here's another. So when we're talking about internalizing negative externalities, I want to suggest, together with a colleague, Justin Leroux, we discuss how you might want to internalize positive climate externalities. So first, it's worth giving some evidence that there are potential net winners from climate change. So the fifth assessment report, for example, says that warming benefits agriculture in high latitude regions in China and the UK, for example. We should expect that northern latitudes would get benefits from tourism. And there's even expectations of even national net productivity gains in places like Canada and Russia. So this is from Collins Stilling et al. And also, we could see this in Professor Rika's work. Rika, of course, talked yesterday, because the national social costs of carbon in Canada and Russia are expected to be negative, which basically means that we could expect small benefits to net benefits to Canada and Russia from climate change. So whether we're talking at sectoral levels or at regional or even at national levels, it looks like there are positive climate externalities. And again, I'm not a denier. This is not a point to say that these are massive or that they're commensurate with the negative externalities. But our point is that a theoretical picture which incorporates these should systematically be able to deal with both positive and negative externalities. Okay, so the standard motivation is very familiar. In ideal market conditions, if we internalize climate externalities and externalities in general, then we will remove market distortions and get better choices. With respect to negative climate externalities, this would be achieved, again, textbook via carbon tax or carbon price more generally. With respect to positive climate externalities, this could be achieved via transfers or subsidies. Okay, so now I'm going to add a little bit of philosophy. So those philosophers who advocate corrective justice believe that the proceeds of the carbon taxes should be directed in a particular way. They should be directed towards those who are harmed. So that's in contrast to some of the things we've heard in this workshop, recycling revenue, for example, to offset distributional outcomes, or to, for example, to buy off incumbent industries or what have you. This is specifically to use those resources to globally affect those who are harmed by climate change. Now we can say that similar reasoning would suggest that we should internalize positive externalities, again, to the extent that they exist. So if so, for positive externalities, we would want some proportion of the proceeds of those positive externalities, those who benefit from climate change, to transfer some of those to emitters. Okay, so a couple of things worth saying. So first of all, this would have to be conditional on them paying first. You would have to have it in such a way that the emitters pay before they are compensated. And so we call this the polluter pays then receives, PPPR repeater principle. And the idea here is that if the polluter pays, then that licenses them receiving, again, in proportion to the positive externalities that they generate. Now, we don't think that this applies to all of the positive externalities. So we distinguish between passive and active climate beneficiaries or winners, where the passive winners are those whose productivity increases without them making active changes in their production methods, let's say, or in their market activity. So entering or exiting markets, changing their agricultural planning. So for instance, we could expect that the wine growers in British Columbia will get a terroir that looks more like California. Their productivity will increase, the quality of their grapes will get better. That's passive in the relevant sense if they didn't have to do anything special. It would be active if, say, in anticipation of this, other wine growers maybe moved their grapes to regions that would benefit in a changing climate or something like this. So this distinction between passive and active, we think is really important, and we have two arguments for why this distinction matters. So the first is that from a political theory point of view, we can say that someone earns or deserves their benefits insofar as they've acted to achieve them, and that isn't the case with passive beneficiaries by definition. And in terms of incentives, those who are passively gaining from climate change don't need incentives, because by definition we've set them up such that they would get those benefits without changing their activity. So those who are taking advantage of the changing climate, we want to incentivize them to do so in order to act in response to a changing climate, in order to capture those potential gains. So to give this as an intuitive illustration, in a changing climate, we would expect demand for adaptation services. Here I'm thinking of sandbags for low-lying flood-prone areas, for example. We would expect there to be demand for these products, for labor as well. And if we were taking the position that we are redistributing all the benefits that come from the climate change, which is something that some political philosophers have advocated, then there would be no incentive for people to enter these markets, offer these services, and offer their labor and so forth. So we would want there to be an incentive for them to act even in response to climate change. Okay.
50 minutes.
Great. So I'm about to conclude. So the idea here is that first, theoretically, from a principled point of view, we can justify a positive rate of time preference in a sort of a broader class than Stern suggested. In particular, I'm trying to draw attention to the principle behind it as opposed to just the idea of extinction. And then secondly, I wanted to suggest, together with my colleague, that if we're thinking about internalizing externalities and we're not thinking about positive externalities, then systematically we might end up under-creating positive externalities. And we're taking that on in a very difficult case, right? The case where the negative externalities are far, far larger than the positive externalities. But we think that if the logic of internalizing externalities applies, it should apply systematically. And then finally, and this is more in context of my philosophy colleagues, suggesting this principle of polluter pays then receives goes beyond the sort of familiar discussions of polluter pays versus beneficiary pays versus ability to pay principles, which are the three main principles that are discussed in political philosophy when trying to distribute the costs and burdens of climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the talk. So we're now about to have our last presenter. So that's Detlef Sprinz from the University of Potsdam and the Institute for Climate Impact Research, also in Potsdam. So he's going to present climate clubs, growth, and stability. Okay, so the floor is yours.
I will try to do a little bit Mission Impossible by presenting material from 3 different papers. The good thing is they're all published, so if you want to really read up on them, you will need a little bit more time than those 50 minutes. I will talk about a paper or a presentation that Håkon cannot be part of, but he has contributed to, And I draw on material, of course, that my co-authors, Jun Hovey, Håkon itself, and Arild Underdal have contributed to in all these papers. I will talk a little bit about agent-based models. So it's modeling related, so a little bit closer to Liam's paper in the beginning of or presentation here. And I want to ultimately answer under which conditions will bottom-up architectures lead to substantial emission reductions, and what are the role of side payments, which could be particularly interesting for this audience here, given the theme of the conference. I will go very quickly through some of this material. I don't have too many slides. Essentially, you have to think about in world politics on climate change on the international side, which is our theme here, about leaders, followers, and outsiders, meaning those who want to initiate essentially clubs, and I will define this a little bit later, followers who are essentially pulled in by leaders, and outsiders being third, those who essentially are unwilling to join any club agreements, whatever is on offer. So even the best compensation will not be able to pull them in. So leaders are those who essentially formateurs of coalitions. They do not necessarily maximize their own welfare, but they are willing to make essentially a reasonable profit as compared to situations when others do not reciprocate. So they look at the situation essentially at coalition stability. Followers are somewhat different. They ask themselves, is it better for me off being in a coalition or not? And they decide on that. So it's a narrow cost benefit analysis calculus. So in the larger framework, we're looking at membership. How does membership influence essentially accomplishments of global public good when we also have some essentially club goods production? And we do not care in this set of papers about the essentially moderating or dialogue function that Climate Club serves and that the IPCC will report on, and others have, like Beiser, etc. And we're not looking at the potential role that privileged leaders may play in world politics. What is important about climate clubs and other clubs is that there is, in this case, a global public good produced, mitigation of greenhouse gases, plus there is a members-only club good, which we essentially operationalize as trade benefits that only accrue to members of a subsection of the UNFCCC. So we're interested in a variety of things. Is bottom up, what are the conditions for growth and potential stability? What perturbations will, well, if perturbations happen, like the US under Trump getting out of the US, of the UNFCCC's 2015 Paris Agreement, what would that entail in terms of follow-on effects for others and for those climate clubs that we have as a baseline? And we researched this with taking on the variety of roles that I mentioned, leaders, followers, and outsiders for a range of countries. We look at, are you allowed to do upgrades of your position as a leader, meaning more than 1 percentage point of GDP that you are willing, that's the entry price for the club membership. Are you willing to upgrade in order to pull in more members? And we also look at the scale to which club goods have to be provided or not. And we also look at side payments, meaning offers on a one-by-one basis rather than generalized across by leaders to potential followers in order to pull them in. All of this is based, of course, on agent-based models. We have calibrated them. The EU, including the UK, unlike the nice paper by the our presentation by Lee, we have the UK still in, or if the UK is out. We have looked at 141 actors in the world system. We look at the roles, the GDP as a snapshot, the same with emissions, but also the discrepancies in vulnerability. What is very important here is it's either you're a member or not, so there's no partial membership. There are essentially it's an open membership policy, meaning if you fulfill the rules of paying 1% of GDP and invest that domestically into mitigation, then you're in if you volunteer to join. And that the club good does exist and it increases with club size, as we have seen in the international trade system, for example. Maybe a couple of benchmarks. I think I have roughly 7 minutes left. A global club, meaning 100% of emissions would be covered and 1% of GDP in each of those countries spent on mitigation, that would reduce global climate damages by 3%. We also run our analysis just with -50% and +50%, and it doesn't really fundamentally change our results. Smaller club accomplishments, which we will see empirically shortly, they are a linear function of that from 0 to those 3% of global GDP, but expressed in a way I will show you shortly. How are the global damage costs determined? I think, and they are unequally obviously distributed, as you will see shortly. It's the country's GDP and the ND gain index. This is in case this here's a country level climate vulnerability index from the University of Notre Dame. Just to fill you up more on so to speak, the prologue, side payments essentially is a way to compensate, to bring into a club and discount essentially the membership fee of 1 percentage point in an extremely cost-efficient way by the lead country. So this is dispenses of essentially generalized rules of bringing in country. It's extremely efficient, as you will see, as compared to the agent-based model I will initially show. Whether this is extremely realistic is a different matter. But we also have ways on looking at how the benefits are then distributed among existing members and only among the enthusiasts. So let me show you a little bit of data that come in. The 3 lead countries we will look at most closely are China, the United States, and the European Union of 28. They absorb much of essentially half of global greenhouse gas emissions. They have an even higher share of global GDP, and most of them have at least some moderate level of vulnerability to climate impacts. We didn't quite include in that leadership group India, which has one of the major impacts categories, not only seen in the ND gain, but also in other climate impact indices. We also were interested, and this is maybe by now history, but if you look at it, that Mr. Trump wanted to bail out, and historically he bailed out of the Paris Agreement technically only for a few months. In a larger sense, he slowed down US efforts internally to some degree, and that may have an effect that exceeds the formal reluctance of the US in terms of international law. Here we see, look at essentially of stability of bottom-up architecture, essentially the perturbation being by a follower taking on a different role as a follower or as a potentially an outsider. We could generalize this actually to look at also China, and actually also the EU, are the best likely candidates. So last 4 slides, we do a little bit of empirics, and this is a difficult to read slide, so I spend a little time on it. First of all, what is in the shaded area is the lead country. That can be 1, 2, 3, like in the top row, you have the US, China, or 3 of them, for instance, at the other end. What you see at the ordinate or y-axis are the emissions, worldwide emissions covered of greenhouse gases. And what you see on the x or coordinate side is essentially the level of club good benefits scale. And if you have none of those, no club goods, it's 0. And if you have 0.25, it's an arbitrary value, but it's exceedingly high of a club good, meaning those members are richly, richly rewarded. Much more realistic values are somewhere in the middle, of course. And that's maybe what we should look at. And what we particularly in evaluating all of these results, there are many more that I don't show, we looked at when are 50% roughly of global emissions covered by a club or not covered, in order to have some weight that we attribute to it. So if the US is in, you essentially need a medium level of the club good scale in order to cover 50% of emissions, knowing that the US is between 13 and 14% in the reference year we have. And on the other hand, you need no club. If you look at the first row, the very right graph, you see that if the three top emitters get together, then right from the beginning, you have 50% of emissions covered. And then another 50% can be pulled in as the club good scale moves from no club good benefits to enormously high one. This is, of course, dreamland, but on the other hand, it's a nice extreme to look at. So rows 2, 3, and 4 look at when one major member like the US begins to abstain, and the solid line shows what is happening if the US is in as a follower, and when the dashed line are the ones if the US is out in the sense that it only wants to be an outsider, meaning it doesn't want to be neither leader nor follower. What you see is, yes, there is an effect. However, it is not catastrophic, in the sense that international cooperation from a bottom-up perspective will fail, but the US will be sorely missed. There's often a discrepancy of at least 14 percentage points. Sometimes there are a few follow-on losses, but they're all on occasion some gains of countries that come into a coalition because the US dropped out. What you also see is, if you look at the bottom row, that if the EU gets in together with the basic countries like Brazil, South Africa, India, and China, it can build a coalition around 50%, even without club goods, and it can build that up further if the US is, of course, a follower. But there is still some potential for meaningful clubs of sufficient size, around 50%. And these are just the increments between the dashed and solid lines. And I will skip this. Let me say in my last minute and a little bit about side payment. Here you see that essentially by spending the money not on generalized rule, but on an extremely kind of case-by-case basis and pulling into countries in from a leader's perspective, we are calling them here the enthusiasts, you can build on average larger coalitions in terms of coverage of greenhouse gas emissions. So the US alone can essentially build a coalition of 2/3 of global emissions, which comprises 48 actors. China only would be able to essentially assemble a coalition just below 50% with 41 actors, and the EU itself around 60% with 50 actors. Whether this is empirically credible is a good question. So let me conclude here with my last slide. The US is essentially able to influence trajectories of bottom-up climate clubs that are mitigation clubs. So there is a cost to global emission reduction efforts, but it's very rarely fatal outright, meaning we don't see a complete collapse under most circumstances. Sometimes we have a few additions, sometimes a few others who follow and getting out. And at very high club good benefits, we see the least of differences. If we aggregate further, we see there are, at least in this field of politics, limits to a US influence in terms of global leadership, both in terms of withdrawing, but in many respects, that should be also applying the other way around. However, I think all of these models have some shortcomings. One of them is we don't have a domestic politics foundations, which I think would be badly needed to enhance our understanding of climate clubs, because ultimately international action by countries rests on domestic foundations, especially if it's costly. And of course, it would be nice to look a little bit more granular what it means if enthusiasm in the EU is waning or waxing. And Liam's paper on Brexit, I think, finds stimulating. We had a similar idea what would happen to all of our results if we take an important EU emitter out. And with this, I conclude. Thank you.